joy and an honor to be able to introduce to you Kathy Gannon, who is among the AP's most senior and most honored international correspondents. You'll see she's a down-to-earth Canadian from Timmins, Ontario, who back in the 1980s accompanied a photographer colleague to Pakistan and ended up staying. 3 to 4 decades now, she's been reporting from Pakistan and Afghanistan, and she's now our senior correspondent for that region. She saw it all: the end of the Soviet occupation, the civil war that followed, the rise of the Taliban. I think she is the only Western reporter who stayed in Afghanistan throughout the Taliban years and was still there at the beginning of the bombing after 9/11. She's utterly fearless, as I know, because she's always asking me to go places where no sane person would go. There are many examples. I think, to her credit, to her integrity, she wanted to embed with both the Pakistan Army and the Afghanistan Army to tell the stories of the war from their perspectives. She has developed sources in the Taliban, some of whom were ministers when she was in Kabul, and later joined the Taliban in Pakistan after the war. She's on a first-name basis with Hamid Karzai. She'll sometimes be talking to me and she said, "Well, Hamid says," and I'm thinking, Hamid Karzai. She believes in getting the story and getting to where it happened, so I think she's will be a very good inspiration for our fellows today. Simply put, she's indomitable. I think you all know that in 2014, April, she was attacked and wounded while reporting on the Afghan elections, and her colleague and dear friend, Anja Niedringhaus, was killed in that same attack. Kathy probably won't tell you, but she almost died as well. It was nip and tuck, and fortunately, her friend Hamid and the U.S. commanders took the extraordinary steps to get her evacuated quickly from a very remote part of Afghanistan. She was put into an artificial coma to keep her intact, and she was operated on in Germany and many times here in New York. And a few years ago, when she was ready to go public with her story, we interviewed her. She said very clearly, "I'm going to go back to work." And I'm very happy to say that this January she did. And she's already got quite a number of nice stories from Pakistan in the last 6 weeks. Her honors include the International Women's Media Foundation Courage Award, CPJ Courage Award, and the Fellow Courage Award. She also was a recipient of the Edward R. Murrow Fellowship in the Council of Foreign Relations. She has written one book, Eyes for Infidel, From Holy Wars to Holy Terror in Afghanistan. And there's at least one U.S. general who made that book required reading in his command. But I think what makes Kathy special is her determination to do her job to the best of her ability. So after she was shot, you can't imagine how hard she worked to get back. The use of her arm, terribly wounded, exercise, physical therapy, and you'll see when she speaks here in a moment just how mobile and resilient she's proven to be. So, Kathy, I'm really honored to have you here, and please come up.
It's a real distinction for me to address the Overseas Press Club Foundation and to talk about our profession, especially to young aspiring journalists. It's an amazing time to be getting into journalism, but it is also a changing time. Our security worries have changed. Public perception of who and what a journalist is or does has become blurred, and respect for our profession has eroded. I am incredibly proud to be a journalist and to be an AP journalist, but we need as professionals to always look at what we do and how we do it. Today as journalists we are targets by militants who see us as bargaining chips, as well as by governments, including those that champion press freedom as fundamental to a working democracy, who see us as a threat to their agenda, muffling us in the name of national security. We report in an increasingly confusing world that requires nuance and understanding to convey information without injecting fear and hysteria into the conversation. We need open-minded reporting that informs and explains. Yet it seems within our profession we are struggling with the concept of the journalist as the impartial observer who seeks to bring clarity to an event or a situation, who is an honest and accurate recorder of history and a consummate observer. The lines have become blurred. Journalists have become advocates or champions of one side or another, but we are neither. We are not advocates, nor are we tasked with a mission other than to investigate, question, and report. To give you an example, the phrase "our troops" is commonly used to explain US troops, or in my case, Canadian troops, without thought to the implications of that simple phrase. As reporters, we are covering a conflict, which means that there are two sides. But once you use that phrase, "our troops," impartiality is tainted. But even worse, the depth and direction of questioning almost always is compromised. Do we look as deeply or as critically at our troops? How are we framing the questions when they are directed at our troops versus another, or the combatants on the other side of the conflict? As the world has become smaller, the conflicts more confusing, and our own profession evolving, I often think back to why I became a journalist, and what I understood was the job of the journalist. I grew up in a small mining town in northern Canada. I wasn't an adventure seeker, but I wanted to know about places far away and different from my own. But first, I understood that I had to know my own country, my own environment, the basics of my profession, or of being a good reporter, before I could even presume to go to another country and understand it and report on it, and ask the people of that country to trust that I could tell their story. For me, being a good reporter embraces so much. It is understanding the value of contacts, how to make them, and how to cultivate them. Being a good reporter is the ability to be empathetic. Whether you are interviewing a child who has lost a limb to a bomb, or a would-be child suicide bomber whose view of the world is skewed by his environment, it is about respecting and knowing the value of the question, why. Whether I'm interviewing former President Hamid Karzai or a former Taliban minister who still espouses his loyalty to the Taliban, what I want most to understand is the why of what they do, what motivates them. I don't want to go into an interview with preconceived notions, preconceived ideas. I go into interviews wanting to ask everything, wanting to know everything, trying always to have an open mind. Explore, understand, learn. These were all the things I wanted to do when I became a journalist. I remember the excitement of starting a story. I still feel that way. To me, it wasn't about wanting to change the world. It was more about wanting to understand the world. Everything was interesting, regardless of what it was I was covering, whether it was a local court story for my hometown newspaper or the fall of the Taliban in 2001. The size of your world doesn't matter. The principle is the same, whether you're covering the education beat for a small town newspaper or covering Pakistan and Afghanistan for the world's greatest news agency, the AP. You're part of a great profession, but the battle to stay the impartial observer is sometimes overwhelming. I have to say, I was surprised and a little dismayed at our profession following the fall of the Taliban, when hordes of journalists entered the city of Kabul, and a significant Taliban leader who had refused to flee when the other Taliban fled gave a press conference in the Afghan capital. Just to set the scene for you, the Taliban had fled Kabul, but they were still in control of Kandahar. Few, if any, of the journalists there had ever had a chance to interview a Taliban leader, and here they were, face to face with one. I listened as journalists, openly hostile to him, threw questions at him, not knowing why he had stayed behind, what dangers that meant for him, not even asking him. Instead, the questions were accusations. "Why aren't you in jail?" asked one reporter. Another sniped, "Shouldn't you be tried as a war criminal?" Not a single question about the movement, about Mullah Omar, a leader who had single-handedly controlled an entire country for 5 years. How was that possible? Where was the curiosity? That same Taliban leader was later killed by the Taliban, shot in the head as he walked in Kandahar with his son. At the time, no one asked why the US-led coalition brought into Kabul a collection of warlords who had committed as many atrocities as the Taliban, and had in fact killed as many as 50,000 Afghans when they were last in power. The questions weren't asked because they were the coalition's allies, the good guys. The Taliban were the bad guys. I'm not going to say they're not the Good contacts, great local colleagues, and even-handed reporting does pay off. It did for me when in 2001 I was the only Western journalist that the Taliban allowed to return to Kabul during the US-led bombing campaign, while they still controlled Kabul. I had been in Kabul throughout the Taliban rule, covered their controversies, always with great detail, the attempts to close the widows' bakeries, deny health and education to women and girls, destroy the statues of Buddha, public executions in the stadium, but never with an agenda, and always I tried with an even-handed pen. During their rule, I made contacts, cultivated them, and with the help of my AP colleague and friend Amr Shah, navigated their country to tell the stories of Afghans throughout the country, men and women. Those contacts, that even-handed, wide-ranging approach paid off, and when everyone else was denied access, I was allowed in, a woman. I could not have been happier. When we look at a story through the prism of good and evil, our stories are colored. Our questions are weak, and in the end, it impacts the information the reader receives. It skews the recording of history. Revulsion of the Taliban skewed impressions of Afghanistan's success. So much so that a British general in 2005 said they expected to move into southern Helmand, a province in Afghanistan, without firing a shot. Instead, they lost hundreds of soldiers, Afghans died by the thousands, and today they are returning to try to retrieve areas lost to the Taliban. Yet there were some who were writing otherwise. Myself and a French journalist friend of mine, our stories back in 2002 seemed out of step. We were writing of opportunities squandered, Afghans disheartened, fearful of a drift back to lawlessness, rule of the gun. We were writing of the thousands of ethnic Pashtuns who tried to join the police and army, only to return angry because they were seen with suspicion because the backbone of the Taliban had been ethnic Pashtuns. A deputy police chief said he sent 2,000 Pashtuns to join the Afghan security forces, and that all returned disillusioned and angry, and all before had joined the Taliban. That was 2002. The signs were everywhere, but no one was looking. If I could take a few minutes now to just explain what I think is the why behind those who find themselves reporting on conflicts. What brings us to countries so far away from home is often a real desire to understand the world around us. I think for many of us, we are driven by the desire to know the people behind the stories that we had read or the pictures we had seen. Sometimes it was the eyes of a picture that made you wonder, what must it be like for this little one? or stories of an outrageous behavior of a leader that made you wonder, how is it possible for this to happen in the world in which I live? As journalists, we join this profession because we are curious. We who go out to conflict areas are satisfying that curiosity to understand the why and how of war, but most especially the who of those caught in the middle, the people. When we go into these conflicts, we are often afraid. We understand the dangers and do the best we can to mitigate those dangers. And then we go, swallowing that fear, finding our courage where we can. When Anja Niedringhaus, my friend and colleague, who died by my side on April 4th, 2014, and I went to host, we wanted to tell the story of the people who would be voting in the presidential elections. Anja wanted the world to know, through her pictures, what Afghans endured to cast their ballot. We did everything right, to call the precautions, and then went where we always went, to the people, to tell their story. What so often gives me strength, and I know gave Anja strength when we went into difficult situations, was the people of those countries. They find a normalcy among the chaos, a humanity among the horror, and that keeps the fear at bay. And when they begin to tell their stories, you forget yourself. You get lost in their story, you want to hear more, see more, understand more. And then, and I understand how unusual this might sound, but on more than one occasion, you really do think, I am just so fortunate to be here, to be able to tell their story, whether through words or pictures or video. The danger, the risk seems to fade. Thank you very much.